Welcome to this week's edition of Done and Dusted. I'm Counsel, an accredited family law specialist. Our co-host is Darren Mort, barrister, filmmaker, author. This week, it's our great pleasure to introduce Justice Jacoba Brasch of the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia. Justice Brasch heads up the critical incident list, and that is a most complex list that deals with families who are in extremely sad circumstances where a parent has died or has been killed. In addition to her work as a judge, Justice Brasch has formerly been a Queen's Counsel working in the specialist area of family law. She's a Fulbright scholar, and she was also president of the Law Council of Australia. I had the great honour of working with Justice Brasch on the board of the Law Council of Australia. Welcome to this week's edition of Done and Dusted. I'm Counsel, your co-host, and joining me is my fellow podcaster, Darren Mort. Hi, Darren. How are you?
Hi, Caroline. You're well?
Oh, we're all well.
You're all
I
well.
just want to let our listeners know that we're honoured tonight by having Justice Brasch of the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia join us. Now, Justice Brasch is in charge of the critical incident list in that court. She is the national list judge. But I thought I might start, Your Honour, just by asking, what is a critical incident? What causes a family to end up in your list and that family in front of you?
What happens is, I think a lot of family lawyers, once they've done it for a while, you wake up and you hear the news in the morning and you know that it's more likely than not a murder suicide or a murder and in jail. And I think most family lawyers go, oh, is this one of mine? So those kinds of matters that we hear about on the news quite often, and when they say there are children, the mother is survived by 3 children. They're the kind of matters, sadly, that find their way into the critical incident list. So a critical incident is there are no parents alive or appropriate to make major long-term decisions for the children. Very sadly, the most typical example is where one parent has killed the other one, allegedly, and then has either killed themselves or is in jail on murder charges. And then there are children who've lost their mum and lost their dad in a heartbeat, and then they don't have anyone. So what makes it critical is urgent, major long-term decisions are needed. So, the children with the paternal auntie or the maternal, whoever they're with, they, of course, as we know, don't have authority to deal with schools or to deal with Medicare, to get a mental health care plan. So the critical is urgent, major long-term decisions are required for the children. And in tragic circumstances where the children have lost both of their parents, murder, suicide, or murder jail being the most frequent one. But then there being some other, I've been doing this now, the list started in June 2022. So we've been going very sadly for a while now. And by and large, the most frequent critical incident is where one parent is dead and the other has died or is in jail. And you've got kiddies, you've got aunts or uncles or sisters or whatever who are grieving themselves, but know that they need to get urgent counselling for the children or, continue NDIS packages or deal with schools because, maybe they've got to change the children's schools. They don't have authority to do so. So that's the critical incident list. And when the matter comes to my attention, I then do those therapeutic orders, if you like. What do the children need within 2 or 3, sometimes 4 days?
Wow.
And do you find it hard, Your Honour, when you've got members of a family that have very little insight in relation to how that family ended up in the list, and they might have quite a jaundiced view of the dead parent? Is that something that you've come across and that's hard to grapple with because their narrative isn't really fitting in with the rest of the evidence?
It does. Grief is a horrible thing. It's a necessary emotion, but I'm very conscious. I take what I call a therapeutic approach to these. And the last thing I want is for these matters, if it can be avoided, to morph into, your normal parenting dispute, because that's usually about one side of the family angry at the other side, and the other side of the family unable to accept, oh my gosh, did my son or daughter do this? And how did we get here? So we have, we try and get through them as quickly as possible. Um, I've had 71 matters now, which is rather frightening since the list started. I will have 3 or 4 a week. Now that's not all first returns, obviously, but that's, first return and then back as after work out who needs to be served back a second time. More than 50% though, we finalise within 4 to 6 weeks. And that's making sure necessary parties are served, getting whatever extra information I have. The co-located officers are they're not natural contradictors, but often no one else turns up on the other side, even though we let paternal
Yeah.
family or maternal wide family know. But there are some that certainly do. Then grief morphs into a potential to use litigation. And we have a wonderful Anne-Marie Rice, Senior Judicial Registrar Anne-Marie Rice,
Yes.
then comes into the field, gets a really experienced child court expert and a Senior Judicial Registrar to bring the families together, try and work through their grief. What do the kiddies need?
Judge, I was going to ask you, one of the last things you were talking about in terms of the court expert, is there a pool of experts that deal with these particular matters? And if so, how closely do you work with those experts as a judicial officer?
The great majority of the critical incident list matters, they just need to have the decision making for the children, and then things go and, people await for, on trial or, and they can always come back on a rice and aspirant if they were acquitted, for example. But no, it's quite, if it's one of the few that the grief morphs into litigation between grieving families, then it's the usual process. A referral's made. I let Senior Judicial Registrar Rice know, as the Executive Director of FDR, that it's a critical, and could you please pick the right CCE, the right Judicial Registrar for this family? And that's her expertise. So she then deals with that.
How fascinating! It's a great adjunct. I remember years ago, and of course, I won't mention any names, but I was acting for a client at lunchtime. After lunchtime, she was no longer alive. She was killed by her husband, and the children, of course, can't imagine what grief they went through. The husband was placed into jail. He was remanded in custody because of the nature of the offence. It was clearly murder, first degree. But there was nothing like the critical incident list at that time. So these children sat in abeyance with their maternal aunt and subsequently copped an application from the father in jail, seeking to have face to face contact. Um, but I gather from you what you're saying, which sounds incredible. We've got this adjunct, the court's providing an adjunct now to then, if there are proceedings, then it would go into those proceedings, proceeding to those matters before the court. A great idea.
Well, the hats off to the Chief Justice. And it actually, ironically, Carolyn and I had a long history together on Law Counsel. And in 2021, Carolyn was on the executive and I was the president of the Law Council. And in and around COVID, I was doing a bit of travel with the Chief Justice. And there was, swearings in, there were courts being opened. And each time, as it turned out fortuitously, I had either just done what would now be a critical incident list or was about to do one. And I said to him, I remember being at the Rocky Courthouse, it was being opened. He said, yeah, it just can't be, the Queensland Homicide Family Support Group know to call Jacoba, who knows to put the weights on a few solicitors to make this happen. This is, what happens in other states.
Sure.
And so we had a number of very sad, high profile killings in that year in Queensland. And I happened to be with the chief. And so then he thought about that. And then not long after I was appointed, he said, I'm going to send you a draft practice direction. And I said, oh, yeah, okay, good. and it was the draft practice direction for the critical incident list. So he listened to this tragic area of need. He had some advocacy from the Queensland Homicide Support Advocacy Group. I did suggest they write to him, and took it to our Family Violence Committee. And now we have this list, which started on the 6th of June, 2022.
Because my
Fantastic.
experience, Judge, was very similar to Darren's in terms of, spouses being murdered and children being left high and dry. And then you had to hope that you ended up in a list where you were given some priority, that a judge who has many other demands on their time was able to prioritize appropriately. But building that expertise, I think that has to be a game changer, because as everybody involved in the list learns, including the practitioners, you then think about savvier ways, better ways of managing the people's expectations, looking after children better, which is what we all want. And also, wherever possible, and it was interesting that you were mentioning the work that gets done behind the scenes with Senior Registrar Anne Rice. You look at alternate dispute resolution when you can pluck the thorns of grief out of the family sufficiently. When can you add that layer and divert the family that would otherwise end up going the full rounds with you? How do you manage to sort of convey to the family that there are these opportunities for them and take the thorns out?
Talk to them about it. And I take the judge you would see in a critical incident list, me, and what you'd see in a normal trial is really quite different. I used the words therapeutic before. It's still justice. It's still very heavily focused on best interests. But it's really become quite amazing when I've had the accused, plenty of accused, appearing before me. Usually they're usually represented. Their criminal lawyers come on board and represent them. They understand that they probably don't want to be swearing affidavits. And they understand that, well, if they get acquitted, well, chances are there's a rice and aspirant. But I talk to them, and I talk to them about, what do we need to do for the kiddies? You know, you're in jail, you're telling me you're innocent. Okay, that you've got to go through a process. And I try very hard to get them to focus on, what do the kiddies really need right now? And of the 71 matters that have come to me since the 6th of June, 2022, only one's actually gone to trial.
Wow.
Mm.
That's a great record. It
Yeah.
really is. Out of tragic circumstances, the fact that you're able to divert the family so significantly away from fully fledged litigation. So fantastic work.
Yeah, no, I wish we didn't have the list. And I saw both of your reactions when I said I do 3 or 4 of these a week, because I mean, that's just tip of the iceberg of, by and large, family violence as it is. Um, it was a list I was hoping not many people would come my way, but it's a list that very sadly is needed. 3 or 4 a week.
Mm.
And as I said before, they're not always first returns. They're about managing and the massaging. And the other thing I do too is, sometimes they cease to be critical. You know, I'll have them before me, first return. Who do we need to serve? Who's the necessary parties? Is there a maternal or paternal, link we need to, see what they want to do, if anything? But then, a talking process, a really focusing on the kiddies. What do they need? And you can always come back to court down the track if needs be. So it's a just approach. It's a best interest approach. But this came out of my experiences are exactly the same as yours, Darren and Carolyn. The very first kind of thing that I ever did, which now would be a critical incident list, and I say this name with the family's permission, was Alison Baden Clay's family. That was 2012. It took 4 years for them to get through the court.
Mm.
And now we're turning things round. Half of the 71 are done within 4 to 6 weeks, and only one has gone to trial. And it had its own very specific dynamics of a family's anger and a family's grief. And 1 out of 71, I don't think is a bad record in being unable to turn that grief away from litigation. And, if people need a trial, they get a trial. But, 4 years as it was for Alison Baden Clay's parents, but now we're turning them around much quicker. But even if I lost my train of thought there for a second, was talking about focusing yet on the children. But even if the matter ceases to be critical, there's still death and there is still tragedy. So I take the matter into my docket anyway, because you don't need these people telling their story to a new person and a new person. So even if I've dealt with the urgent and then we've got, maternals wanting this, paternals wanting that, then I keep it with me and manage the matter. It's a national list, obviously, apart from WA. And our national case management judge approves me then to go to wherever the families might be if they need a trial. So they kind of queue jump, but I would hope people would understand these are just the most tragic of circumstances where I don't want them to tell their very sad stories to a new judicial officer, so it stays with me nevertheless. And the other thing I need to add, though, the critical incident list stuff I do outside of normal court hours. So it's not
Oh,
taking up
wow.
from my normal docket.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah. So, well, and think about it, Darren, because urgent, because if I get a matter on, let's say today, a matter came to me and I listed it for Wednesday, most practitioners are going to be busy. So if
Yeah.
I listed at 9 in the morning or at 2 o'clock or at 4:30, then chances are they're out of court or they can organise that. So I also, and I know my second returns, I do outside of the normal hours as well. So I can keep going with my normal docket and practitioners can keep going with their work and not having to, you know,
Yeah.
ditch things or stuff things around or flick it around. Continuity, I think, is really important in these matters.
Darren and
It's
I were recently at Pacifica Congress up in Cairns,
Yeah.
and there was a fabulous segment that Darren was actively involved in terms of vicarious trauma for professionals. And of course, I got to speak to Justice Coate in relation to the work that she was doing in terms of child sexual abuse. What sort of support is there also for the professionals at court that are dealing with these families in the most tragic of circumstances?
I've been doing this a long time. So I
Mhm.
had my skills and my tips. I was assisted many years ago. I had to do a countdown of how 31 people died in floods we had in Queensland 10 years ago. And I was telling the police commissioner about it. And before I knew it, there was a knock on the door at Chambers of police psychologists talking to me about it, which I learned invaluable skills. But what does the court do? The Chief Justice and I launched toward the end of last year, a vicarious trauma awareness video for mainly our associates, our LCMs, your third and fourth year uni students who this can be pretty big stuff. So that's now publicly available. They have to watch it. New employees have to watch it at the 3 month mark and every 6 months after that. Because, I mean, and we get training, we have EAP programs, all of that sort of stuff available to us. But I was very worried about our associates now, legal case managers who are third, fourth year uni students who might be seeing stuff that is incredibly confronting. And I didn't want them to think, oh, to be a lawyer, I've got to be on, I can't show any weakness. So we had those supports and skills. I talk to our psychologists. I try and check in every quarter because this stuff eats away at you. And it's really important for practitioners to know that every one of the horrible things that we see as family lawyers, I think they just take a little bite of you each time. And you've got to be able to come up with your own skills and your own ways to be able to deal with it and put it in a box that makes you safe and as safe as you can be.
it's getting worse, Judge. I swear it is getting worse. The violence is I've never come across more violence in my life. I'm acting for a lot of men lately, but I just can't believe the violence and the impact. And in the last 3 weeks, I've had 2 associates have to leave the court because they were obviously upset.
Yeah.
A man that I had punching his wife in front of the child in the face while the child's under the table. It was just viscerating. It was just terrible. Absolutely terrible.
I wonder, now I don't know, Darren, but I wonder if the prevalence has got higher or has the awareness and reporting got higher. I don't know.
Yeah, true.
I don't know.
I think there is very much that incident of reporting has become quite commonplace. I think the channels through which people can communicate that they are targets of family violence have opened up considerably. If you think about when we first started practice, and you think about the fact that police wouldn't turn up to a domestic and they didn't see it somehow as being part of community policing, compared with current day thinking, uh, I think it might be awareness. But I also think in the states that experienced greater lockdown and greater personal deprivation of liberty, if you will, during COVID, I saw a huge, as did Darren, we saw a huge explosion of family violence. And I'm talking about the southern states. I'm really talking about
Oh,
Victoria.
Yeah.
and all of the family violence centres, all this huge spikes they got. But I also think part of it too is, I mean, how many times did you hear someone saying, "Could I didn't hit her"? No, you took her credit cards, you this, you that, or the
Yeah.
whatever. Um, our awareness of what is family violence now, I think, is far more
Yes.
nuanced and subtle. And something, Carol, and I remember you and I talking about years ago, a decision, I think it was a state court decision, came out, and whoever it was said, "Oh, yeah, he hit it, but it was 10 years ago, so that's okay." And I remember you and I talking about, but he's shown he can. He's
Yeah.
shown
Yeah.
he can.
So
And I
that
think our
court,
thinking has moved.
that case I can talk about because it's in the public domain. And that was the case of Julie Ramage. Jamie Ramage was the husband. He was jailed. And the reason I can talk about it is because, as I said, it was a criminal law case and it also changed the law of provocation in the state of Victoria. I don't think a Supreme Court justice would take that same approach these days, because that is definitely a display of power and control.
Yeah.
And we know at the heart of all family violence is power and control.
But
So,
that was the thinking then. But our
yeah,
thinking has, so that comes back to Darren, has the prevalence increased or has the awareness, the understanding? I don't know. There will be
I think
scholars who
that
will write about that.
I think there's a much greater understanding, in my experience, appearing in court with a lot of these cases, with coercive control. I think, although that's the hip word people are using, I think people are getting a much deeper and better understanding of what that actually entails, how it encapsulates a whole range of things. You mentioned them before, like financial abuse being one of them. But I think that's really, yeah, it's really. Can I just jump back for a sec for what you were talking about? Because I was on the periphery, though I'm a resident as well down at Phillip Island. It's a little island where there's penguins around, Judge.
Yeah, I
Um,
know that one down the
probably not,
Mornington
yeah.
Peninsula.
Anyhow, there was a very graphic, awful murder that took place down there a few years ago. And the husband went to jail, of course, for murder. I think he might have passed away by now, but in any event, there were a couple of kids. And what your list is doing is not only um, addressing the needs of these poor kids and their family circle, their intimate family circle, but in a case like the one I just said, the grief spills out like waves into the community. And if the community can see that these things are being addressed and they hear about it from the inner family sanctum or the kids or their teachers or whatever, I think that's a really positive thing because that grief gets addressed, that greater grief that we often don't address because we're looking at the immediate concerns of the kids, of course. I was just thinking when you were talking about it, I thought, wow, this is really good because it does address that, you know?
Well, one of the, I don't publish many decisions in this. So if you look on Jade or Osler, you're not going to see many decisions because quite often the facts would identify who
Sure.
parties were. And I thought, oh, I could really, I could not say much about the identifying facts, but then I worry about the family. Do they not feel heard? So I publish some every now and again. But that's, if I can get the kiddies, their schooling looked after, if I can get their mental health looked after, that's not only good for the kiddies, but that's good for the aunt or the uncle or the grandma or the grandfather who's suddenly become a parent again, but
Yes,
has got their own grief as well.
exactly.
Um, so I
Mm.
hope, it's a therapeutic, as I call it, a therapeutic approach, all guided by the best interests. And when I do, I mean, every family, when I give final reasons, I do give judgments. So, I give judgments. I just don't, for the reasons I explained, publish a lot of them. And in the 60cc, other, anything else,
Yes.
what I often say there is this list is designed to, where it's in a child's best interest, to get a grieving family or families in and out of the system as quickly as possible. And that itself I consider to be in a child's best interests.
Yeah.
So that's not
Absolutely.
every matter, but that's certainly a lot of them.
Yeah, the shorten the trauma of the court, you shorten the trauma in the life of the child. Believe it or not, we've run out of time, but we'd love to have you back and talk about this again. Judge, thank you so much, not only for coming on to Done and Dusted, but also for the great work that you're doing in that space. We
Absolutely.
greatly appreciate it
Absolutely.
because these kids do need a guardian angel, and you may as well be it.
Yeah.
You're both
Absolutely.
very kind. You're both, and I hope I don't want to see any of your listeners or you two on the list, because that means there's been tragedy. But
Yes.
if you
Exactly.
need it, I'm here.
Thank you.
Amazing.